Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. Welcome to my channel. My name is Ogbanje Joseph. Please subscribe to this channel, share, like, as well as drop a comment on the comment section. So, today our lecture is titled Dimensions and Scope of Diplomacy. Dimensions and Scope of Diplomacy. Now, diplomacy is the peaceful conduct of relations among political entities, their principals, and accredited agents. Diplomacy is sometimes regarded as a necessary, as necessary but regrettable at other times with deep respect. Diplomacy has seldom, if ever, had a more significant role to play in human affairs than it has at present. The necessity for organized dialogue in an era when relative certainties of a bipolar state system have given way to a disorderly, confused multipolarity is witnessed by the frenetic pace of contemporary diplomatic activities. The collapse of long established hegemonies and the reemergence of long neglected enmities have placed a high premium on the work of those skilled in mediation, negotiation, and representation. In the meantime, efforts to restructure and revive existing international institutions have tended to focus public attention as much upon the execution and the administration of foreign policy. Now, some time ago, Lord Strange, a former British diplomat, remarked, "In a world where war is everybody's tragedy and everybody's nightmare, diplomacy is everybody's business." The diplomatic process, its machinery and conventions has grown steadily more complex, usually in its fits and starts. Its growth has been a response to the interconnected developments of more complicated governing structures in human societies, and consequentially more complicated things they have wanted to negotiate with each other or represent to one another. There are also changes occurring in the global distribution of power which follow from changes both in the nature of power itself and consequential changes in its location. Such change brings the risk of conflict in multifarious forms and raises the profile of diplomacy. There are changes too to be seen in the character of states. The states have been, since the 17th century, the principal and sometimes the only effective international actor. Now, there are more states than ever before, differing more widely in type, size, and relative power. Now, this factor alone has greatly increased the quantity of diplomatic activity and the scope of topics that are discussed. Some of these topics are now derived from new economics, financial, and technological issues which transcend the traditional role of the states and operate on a global horizontal basis, disconnected from the essentially vertical state structure. Dialogue between old and new sources of power and old and new centers of authority are blurring the distinctions between what is diplomatic activity and what is not. Such dialogue is also creating an additional layer of diplomacy in which non-state actors communicate both with states and associations of states and other non-state actors, and vice versa, and vice versa. The effect has certainly been an explosion of diplomatic and quasi-diplomatic activity. Now, let us look at the content of modern diplomacy. One of the most striking aspects of post-war diplomacy is the rapid growth in the volume of diplomatic activities since the end of 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. To a large extent, this has come about because of the expansion of multilateral and regional diplomacy, much of which is economic or resource related. The changes in volume can be seen in the number of treaties that are conducted among nations annually, which doubled since the end of the Second World War. The broadening of the international agenda, especially since the 1970s, into issues concerning trade, technology transfer, aviation, human rights, transnational environmental and sustainable development questions has continued with the increasing addition of novel or revived threats. Examples of the latter include global sea level rise, stratospheric ozone depletion, environmental sabotage, terrorism and black market nuclear material trade, and so on. Underlying the expanded diplomatic agenda are a range of issues concerning the relationship between domestic and foreign policy, sovereignty, and adequacy of agreements and arrangements at the bilateral, regional, and international or global level. The point can be made more generally in terms of the widening content of diplomacy. At one level, the changes in the substantive form of diplomacy are reflected in terms such as dollar diplomacy, oil diplomacy, resource diplomacy, atomic diplomacy, and global governance diplomacy. Thus, what constitutes the contents of diplomacy today goes beyond the sometimes rather narrow political strategic conception given to the term. Nor is it appropriate to view diplomacy in a restrictive or formal sense as being the preserve of foreign ministries and diplomatic service personnel. Now, let us look at players in diplomacy. A major feature of modern diplomacy is the enhanced role of personal diplomacy by the head of state or government. Usually, such initiatives are at the expense of the local ambassador, who might have only limited formal involvement, for an example, in a special summit. However, while the importance of political reporting, part of traditional diplomacy, has been eroded by developments in communication, the decline of the role of ambassadors is overstated. The role remains important in terms of explanation of policy at crucial moments, political assessments, involvement in economic and trade work, and participation from time to time in international conferences. Now, the growth of post-war multilateral diplomacy has seen periodic involvement of wider range of ministries, with some involvement in external relations such as industry, aviation, environment, shipping, customs, health, education, and sports. The task for the foreign ministry or otherwise is to coordinate both formulation and implementation of international agreements. This is particularly important in technical agreements, which choice of presentation, drafting of instructions, and follow up post-conference activities are especially important. Non-state actors have proliferated in number and types, ranging from traditional economic interest groups through to resource, environmental, humanitarian, criminal, and global governance interests. In some instances, non-governmental organizations are closely linked to official administrations, while others are transnationally linked. Above all, the internationalization of non-governmental organizations in the diplomatic process, especially in multilateral conferences, has become an important distinguishing feature of players in modern diplomacy. Thank you very much.